Budget special, including a shortened Newsnight Scotland.
Language of New Labour, but was the message inside his box any more than old Labour tax and spend? Good evening. The National Health Service is the battleground on which Labour thinks it'll fight the next election. There's no gainsaying the huge scale of today's injection of cash to the NHS, nor is there any attempt to disguise the fact that the government intends to keep taking more of our money in tax than the Tories ended up doing. So did Labour keep its appointment with the faithful? We've been asking the doubters in one of the key marginals. It was called a budget for e-commerce. Is it impressed? And with guests including the Labour rebel Peter Kilfoyle, who left the government alleging a betrayal of core voters, the former Health Secretary and Chancellor Kenneth Clarke, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and the editor of the Financial Times will be assessing whether this is a budget which can finally settle anxieties about the NHS. The government news machine had organised for the Chancellor of the Exchequer to have a public breakfast today. Unfortunately, no one had told him that being in a cafeteria, he'd have to pay for it. Or maybe he's like the Queen and doesn't carry money on his person. Anyway, someone had to buy it for him. But when it came to his budget statement, money was, by common consent, one thing he had in abundance. The only question was how he would choose to spend it. First off tonight, our political and economic editors, the Laurel and Hardy of Newsnight, as it were, Evan Davis and Mark Mardell. Now, Evan, health was the headline in this.
Indeed. Spring is very much in the air. The economy is doing very well, and the Chancellor chose to turn that economic good fortune not into tax cuts, but into health spending. Now, you remember Tony Blair wanted 8% of our economy to be spent on the NHS. If we look at what the Chancellor, in fact, pledged today we're spending... it'll come up there, spending 6.8% of our GDP on health. By the end of 2003, which was the planning horizon, Chancellors pledged to get up to 7.6%. Not quite what the Prime Minister wanted, but still 6.1% growth. 6.1% growth a year in real terms.
Now, what are the implications for other spending?
Yeah, well, the Chancellor's most striking action today, I think, was to preempt the spending review. He basically announced the totals for spending throughout the spending review. As a result, the ministers now just have to fight over that total. It's like a game of musical chairs. He's put the chairs out, he's taken 5 away and given them to the NHS and said to the ministers, you can fight over the remainder. It's now nothing. It's not my problem, Gov.
Now, Mark, this was... we're not overplaying it and saying this was a pre-election budget, were we?
Well, no, there's obviously going to be another budget, or presumably going to be another budget before the election, but it's laying the ground for the general election.
And this would be the last one that could make any impact in people's pockets.
Yes, because obviously it needs to sink in. If you do this in a real pre-election budget, then people just think, well, it's a gimmick, it's a few months away from an election. They don't take any notice of it. So a cabinet minister was saying to me, he thinks they've got it the right way around, and all previous Labour governments got it the wrong way around. They spent, front-loaded it, and then ran out of money towards the end. They're now spending towards the end. I think another way of looking at it was that forget all the problems that the Labour government's had in terms of Ken Livingstone, control freaks, all that sort of stuff. The real crisis they've had is people's attitude towards the NHS. People didn't think that the spending was doing any good, didn't think that they were delivering, and that worries all sorts of people who came over to them last time.
I thought William Hague put up quite a spirited performance in the Commons, but it was quite a difficult target for them to go at, wasn't it?
Yes, it is very difficult, because obviously they have to say in their briefs that they've been giving out, they're saying, well, of course, health and education, it's good to spend on those things, but there's lots of money being wasted. But still, the majority of his attack was on the idea that Labour puts taxes up. They say that this is taking the government as a whole. It's an 8p, the equivalent of an 8p on the basic rate. So I think the next election is going to be about tax and spend once again.
Have they come clean, Evan, on the tax burden question?
The statistics are in this red book which they produced. They do, I think, fiddle the figures a little bit. They count the working family tax credit as a negative tax rather than public spending. But if we look at the figures on the tax burden, last year of the Tory government, 35.3% of GDP was taken in tax. They were borrowing quite a lot, it has to be said there. Next year, this Chancellor will be taking 36.9%. That is about 1.5% of GDP more in tax. At the end of the planning horizon, which we've got figures for, 36.6. Of course, there are two factors going on there. There are tax rises, and the Chancellor has raised taxes. He is prudent, he has done all that. But there's also a lot of good luck. He's benefited from the economy just giving him more tax revenue.
Now, what's your assessment, Mark, of how this is going to play?
Well, it was quite interesting. I spent yesterday in the Commons talking to Labour MPs, and they were unanimous, left, right and centre. They said it's time to deliver for our core vote. And I spent today trying to find out whether Gordon Brown has actually done that.
Okay, thanks very much.
This morning, the Chancellor had to borrow a £5 off his adviser to pay for what was no doubt a prudent breakfast. Money is what it's all about, and convincing voters it's worth handing over their hard-earned cash to the taxman. If there was such a thing as Brownism, the first part of the budget would have defined it. He spoke in praise of enterprise, coined the phrase civic patriotism, announced more measures to get single parents and the over-50s long-term unemployed back to work, and spoke with passion about a war on child poverty.
A sure start for all Britain's children is not only right, but it is the best anti-crime, the best anti-drugs, the best anti-unemployment, the best anti-dependency policy for this country's future.
The first cheer was for putting up the winter allowance for pensioners by £50, but there was a small stir of disappointment on Labour benches when it was clear pensions themselves weren't going up. A look of relief crossed Conservative faces. It was wiped off by the big money. First £1 billion on education, then health.
We have decided that in the years from now until 2004, the NHS will grow by twice as much, by 6.1% a year, over and above inflation, by far the largest sustained increase in NHS funding in any period in its 50-year history.
Gordon Brown isn't just the Chancellor, he's also the man in charge of Labour's election strategy. And it's a difficult job keeping together the precarious coalition that is New Labour. And in the last few weeks, senior Labour MPs and the ministers have been telling him and the Prime Minister they must do more to please Labour's core voters. So has he pulled it off in this budget? We went to Peterborough to find out. If enough voters here lost faith in Labour, that could be the end of the Labour government. It's exactly the sort of marginal seat where it's vital Labour keeps happy both the old Tory voters who switched to them last time and those people who stuck with them through thick and thin, until now. It's not the old industrial working class who most worry Labour MPs, but middle-class opinion formers, like head teacher Chris Walford. He's voted Labour for more than 30 years. 3 months ago he decided he wouldn't do so again, directly because of the crisis in the NHS and the way schools were treated. This budget hasn't yet persuaded him back into the fold, but he says teachers will be pleased.
I think there will be an element of surprise because it is significant. It is unusual. But I think at the end of the day, the teaching profession will want to see what the long-term intentions of the government are in terms of the education service. There's a lot of scepticism about at the moment.
At Peterborough Cathedral, Canon Jack Hyam told us he'd expected more of the Labour government. He'd like higher taxes, less emphasis on the worries of the rich, more concerns about poverty. Before the budget, he was thinking of voting Lib Dem next time. Now he's pondering what to do.
I was resonating with a lot that Gordon Brown was saying, because my concern as a pastor really is for people, and especially for the poor. The rhetoric is good. What I really need to do is to wait and see and to judge in due course what actually happens, and whether it will in fact mean that the health service improves. One assumes that it must, with that amount of money being put in. Whether schools improve, I think, is more doubtful with the amount of money.
Tony Blair will make a statement about the NHS tomorrow, leading from the front on the health service, just as he faced doctors and nurses in a Newsnight debate.
You've had large increases in health service spending, followed by cutbacks in health service spending. If you want to make the health service better, you have got to get year-on-year substantial increases over a large period of time. And the only way you do that is by making sure you manage the economy properly at the same time.
The health service will be told the money comes with strings attached. Modernisation is expected. One cabinet minister told me the cash would provide lubrication, making it easier for the health professionals to change. As a shift ends for one team of the East Anglian Ambulance Service in Peterborough, they like what they hear, sort of.
We are done.
It sounds good, but it depends what they're going to do with it. I mean, if it's going to filter down to us as in more equipment, as in more staff, more doctors, more nurses, then it's great. But if it's like it normally does and ends up with more managers, then obviously it won't be, will it? That's what normally happens. They normally end up with more managers, more quangos and more form filling.
In a complex budget that many politicians found it difficult to get their heads round, Gordon Brown made no big new announcements on personal taxation, just confirming a penny cut in income tax would go ahead in April, and he mocked demands for more cuts.
I've examined proposals from all sides of the House, including one from the current Shadow Chancellor, who on the 6th of March, and I quote, said, he can either reduce taxes or increase public spending. What I would recommend is that he use the money to reduce taxes.
But William Hague made much of Labour's previous rises in indirect taxation.
So any reductions announced today pale into insignificance beside the huge increases already in place or in the pipeline. The Chancellor is like a mugger who grabs your money and then wants you to thank him for giving you your bus fare in order to get home.
Back in Peterborough, that's what worries Ronnie Baker. He's got his own small glazing business and voted Labour for the first time in '97. He's not sure what he'll do next time. He's pleased about the spending on health. He thought it was a good budget, but is still worried about those taxes.
I think we all pay too much tax. I think he should lower it a little bit more. There's got to be more scope for business to play our profits back into the business. We just seem to be taxed out of all proportion to possibly the rest of Europe.
In marginal seats like Peterborough, voters will take time to absorb the budget and will judge by results. Nearly everyone who voted Labour last time round wanted to see quick improvements in the health service and schools, and the government has clearly been shaken by the perception that things aren't getting better. This budget is an attempt to win back hearts and minds.
Well, now, just before we get into the politics of this, health was the big theme of the budget, and I'm joined now by Stephen Thornton of the NHS Confederation. You saw Tony Blair tonight. Do you get the impression that he is serious about making a change to the NHS?
Oh, very serious indeed. I think it was quite a brave move on his part. He made a very public commitment to a publicly funded National Health Service. He put his money where his mouth is, and in a sense, our success and his success are sort of bound up together.
The government's been playing pretty fast and loose with a lot of figures, both in the NHS and in the police and so on. Is he serious this time?
Yes, he is. I think they've learnt from the fact that they really rather oversold and overhyped the 21 billion associated with the previous comprehensive spending review. And I think it's one of the problems in the health service that people's expectations tend to run ahead of our ability actually to deliver. And I think the government has realised that they've been partly responsible for that.
Oh, do you mean talking like that actually stoked up expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of talking up public expectations. And I think one of the things we've all got to do is to be clear that although we have got very significant additional resources here, it really is going to take us time to sort of turn this tanker around.
Will it be enough to prevent another crisis next winter?
Well, that's going to be difficult. We're going to give it our best shot, but of course the problem this last winter was about capacity, bed capacity, staffing capacity and so on. And to build that back into the system, it is going to take us some time.
Stephen Thornton, thank you. Well, the man who has to decide which department gets what's left after the NHS injection is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Andrew Smith. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking whether he admits that the tax burden would remain higher, despite today's budget, than when Labour came to power.
No, Jeremy, because this budget is cutting tax. The tax burden on a typical family next year is going to be at its lowest since 1972. And when you put all of the measures in all of our budgets together, for a family with children, that's £850 a year better off.
But, I mean, according to your own red book, this thing called Prudent for a Purpose, it specifically says that in 1995 to 96, it was 35% of GDP, and it never gets back anywhere near that. And the last year for which a projection is given, 2004, it's over 36%. Now, in anybody's book, that is higher.
Look, Jeremy, we published the Red Book. We've been perfectly open about the figures in the Red Book, but I'm not going to accept a charge that the tax burden is rising when the tax burden is actually falling.
I didn't say that.
When we've cut the basic rate of tax, and when families are so much better off.
I didn't say it was rising. I said, are you now conceding, as the book concedes quite explicitly, that the tax burden now is higher than when you came to office and will remain higher than when you came to office?
I haven't challenged the figures in the Red Book, Jeremy, and what I'm also stressing is they show the tax burden is now falling.
The answer is yes. Let's get to some of the implications of these spending commitments. This extra money for the NHS, which everybody welcomes, of course, will it enable you to meet the Prime Minister's commitment of hitting the European average?
it puts us on course to hit that average. It doesn't actually I mean, you see, you've got to take account of what's going to happen to European spending and so on. So I'm not making the claim that by the end of the spending period it hits the average, but it puts us on course to hit that average, and it is an enormous boost, 35% real increase in health service spending.
On this basis, you hope that you will meet it, and you're more or less on target.
It will put us on course to hit it.
Fine. What areas of government spending are going to have to be cut to meet this ambition?
Well, along with the investment in health today, we also announced £1 billion for education, 285...
That wasn't my question.
Well,
I wasn't asking about the NHS. Everybody applauds the extra money for the NHS, but which departments are going to suffer, have their budgets cut, or live within tighter constraints than expected in order that these targets can be met?
Well, I've already pointed to the increases we've been able to make next year for education, transport and combat.
I'm not asking about those.
Of course, there will be tough questions asked of every budget, just as we'll be asking tough questions about the allocation of this extra money to health. But I can't, on the programme tonight, preempt the spending review which takes place between now and July.
You just have preempted it. You preempted it today.
No, we haven't at all, because the other thing that the Chancellor announced today was that there will be the 2.5 annual increase that we'll provide in the overall spending envelope. And what we have to do now is to decide how best to allocate that money for the other services which haven't been announced today.
Well, you have preempted the spending review by announcing these particular targeted areas of growth. The consequence of those will be that public expenditure will grow at a slower rate than the economy will grow, correct?
No, Jeremy, it's not correct. We have
to
make
how do you do the sums then? If you strip out the NHS figures, you are left with a projected rate of growth of public expenditure which is lower than the rate of growth of the economy.
Of course, the rate of growth of other areas can't all be at the same level that it's been of what we've announced for the National Health Service.
No, the overall.
I believe the public will accept that we have made the right decision.
I'm obviously not being clear. My point is...
I think you're very clear, Jeremy.
In that case, you're deliberately not answering the question. My point is not about the NHS. My point is about overall levels of public expenditure. Is it not the case that the amount of money available for public expenditure is lower than the projected rate of growth of the economy once you take out what you've spent today?
You've still got the allocation between different services to
examine,
and that's what we'll be doing in the spending review, and it doesn't mean that significant increases where they're justified can't be made available. And obviously we're going to look very hard at that.
You like your job?
I love it.
Well, we're joined now in the studio by the former Chancellor Kenneth Clarke, by Peter Kilfoyle, who parted company with the leadership recently because he felt that core voters were being rather let down, and Matthew Taylor of the Liberal Democrats. You presumably, Peter Kilfoyle, are quite pleased with this budget.
I'm pleased. Obviously, you can't be anything but pleased with a billion extra on education, 2 billion immediately into the health service. But as with all these things, Ken's done it many times, he was a master at it, that you make a statement and it presents a certain picture. The devil, as always, is in the detail. If you take education, if you're going to put money into a school pro rata, according to the numbers of kids, what you have to recognise is that you may need to put a lot more money into those sink schools, which by definition don't attract the numbers that you require. Likewise with the health service, we want to see how it's dispersed around the country in the different regions of the health service. There are different demands in different areas.
We'll come to the regional question in a moment or two, but Kenneth Clarke, I mean, for all his valiant efforts today, William Hague didn't actually find it a very easy budget to attack, did he? Because no one can really quibble with more money for the NHS.
Well, they're always difficult to attack. It's the most difficult speech of all to make as leader of the opposition, because particularly with Gordon, when he sits down, most people don't understand in any detail what he said. He rattles through it. It was a rather poor speech, and you have to leap for the red book and the press releases to find out what's happened. Where William was right, and I think the big problem for the government is, firstly, the tax burden is going up. There was no tax cutting on balance in this budget at all. The tax burden continues to rise. The increases in spending really start from 2001, apart from the very welcome increases now on health and education. But the 2.5% real terms growth per year after 2001 is indeed less than the growth of the economy that's being forecast. So it's tight on tax in the sense this is a taxing government, and on expenditure, Gordon sold it well. That's what a budget speech is for. But the fact is, the guy you were just interviewing does not have a great deal of money to distribute, and because already health and education have quite rightly preempted a lot of it, there's going to be a lot of pain throughout the rest of the public service.
You presumably, Matthew Taylor, though, were thrilled that there were so few tax cuts.
I think that broadly he's done the right thing on education. I mean, he's actually to the penny spent what we suggested he should. It will bring up health spending substantially, but it's been bought at a cost. And the cost is that, in fact, there are tax cuts, a penny off income tax and tax cuts for big business.
That was last year's budget.
Well, that's not coming through till this April.
No, but
that is money he's had to... It was. It's money he still had to find. And the result is that this health money has been bought from a very specific group of people. It's been bought by taking money out of Social Security, budgeted expenditure, and that means that it's meant not having a substantive increase for pensions.
Surely it's
That's
a good
why
thing that the Social Security bill has fallen.
No, that means what pensioners are getting is 75p a week, 1.1%. That's not sharing in the growth of the economy that Labour promised. That's where they found the money for this health increase, because they've also gone for a tax-cutting agenda.
How is this going to play in the Labour heartlands that you're so worried about?
The two areas in my postbag, my surgeries, that were most important would have been the pensioners and certainly the health service. And I was very taken with your clip. When you listen to the ambulanceman and when you listen to the pastor, they were talking about outcomes. They weren't talking about money. These figures, you can invent these figures if you want to. I'm sure Ken did on occasion. But having said that, people are concerned with how it's translated into positive action. That will take time to feed through. So what they really want to ensure is that when they go to hospital, that to an A&E, for example, they get attention. They want to make sure that waiting times are cut. That will take time for that to become apparent. It's a perception that counts. It's not these huge figures of money, welcome though they are.
Yes, but I mean, the perception is one thing. You hope it's the same as the reality, but either way, the perception or the reality does depend upon money being spent, and this is a heck of a big increase in NHS.
Absolutely, and everybody has to welcome this, but in direct answer to your question, what people on the ground want to see is the positive translation into action, and they won't make up their real mind when it comes to their electoral intentions until they see things changing in the A&E ward, in the schools and everywhere else.
What advice would you give William Hague and Michael Portillo about how they might present their views on tax cuts in this environment?
Well, I think they're quite right to keep pointing out that taxes have been increased and they are continuing to increase, and unless you are very low paid and with children, you're probably going to find your taxation will rise. That slogan used by Andrew, that the average family is paying less tax in 1972, is a complete fraud. That's another political advisor's slogan, because it leaves out all the indirect taxes. That's fine as long as you don't spend any money. Actually, the average family finds its taxes going up. On health, what William should say is we do welcome the health increases we have, but we need to get it in proportion. The government is panicking over health because it starved the health service and education of money for the first 2-3 years, as the Liberals kept saying. They abolished our annual spending rounds. I couldn't believe the Secretary of State for Health stuck to that. As Matthew and I'm sure, have both said repeatedly, they couldn't stick to that. The 21 billion figure they used was a fraud, and as we always said, they've had to add 2 billion to it. Now, from now on, particularly after 2001, beyond the next election, more money is going to come in. But even that is not unprecedented. 6.1% a year is very good, and I do welcome it. But in the past, we've had years when 9% plus was actually added to the NHS budget. And it'll take a long time before Peter's constituents see this improvement in the service, which quite honestly, in Liverpool and in Nottingham, I am quite sure they perceive as deteriorating since this government came in.
The problem with, I mean, Ken in effect is criticising his own, of course, budget plans, which the Labour Party rather surprisingly stuck to.
No,
but
you're
Ken,
as bad as Andrew. That's not true.
Ken, what is also the case, you're complaining, and rather loyally on behalf of William Hague, about tax increases. Of course, you planned tax increases yourself because you had a huge deficit. And one of the problems the government's had in the early years of this Parliament is they haven't increased spending. They've increased tax to cover your deficit, but they haven't actually put spending in. Now, at last, they've recognised that that was a problem on health. They're not going to manage it on education. They'll actually spend less on education than you did over the course of the Parliament. And that is a problem there. And on pensions, even worse. And that's why Labour people haven't seen the results they've expected. They'll now see them on health, but there are big gaps in the rest of the programme.
I mean, if you're right, and it may be impossible to meet these apparently firm targets, Tony Blair has taken quite a political risk, hasn't he? Because he has personally associated himself with it. Tonight, meeting these NHS officials, this budget, tomorrow a big launch. It's a political risk for him, isn't it?
Oh, they have panicked over health, quite rightly. I mean, if they listened to the public, they were right to panic, because a service that people expected they would improve was deteriorating, and it wasn't our figures. They actually squeezed it. They've gone far too far beyond what they should have done in getting the public finances right, because they were pretty okay when they took over and were on course to get balance. They didn't need to raise all that tax on business and pensions, and they've left it there. And in the health service, what Tony will be addressing tomorrow is what else needs to be done. We must give up all these silly targets for waiting lists, this expenditure on new gimmicky services when the hospitals are short of money. It's got to get hold of the management as well. They've wasted 3 years
I have to say, Ken, it's a bit rich for you to go on about what we have or haven't done in terms of health. You know and I know we inherited a mess, and you were partly responsible for that. Yeah. The truth is we come from a low base. I accept the criticism about the expectations that were raised, but I think that the concern about that criticism has been responded to in today's budget. You yourself said a 6.1% increase on average year on year is to be applauded. You can't condemn a government that actually listens to its critics.
Except that they left it so late, and the patients who have suffered because of those early cuts must be wondering now why it was they said they couldn't find the money, because it's absolutely obvious from today's decisions the money was always there, but they tried to use smoke and mirrors to mask what was really going on and have been caught out.
I bet you're pretty glad, aren't you, that you're not at the Ministry of Defence, given what's been taken out of the still at the Ministry of Defence, given what's been taken out of the available public money this summer.
Well, I had a very happy time at the Ministry of Defence, a fine body of people.
You're going to find it surely difficult to get much money out of this Chancellor?
Not at all, not at all. I mean, I find Gordon masterful in the way in which he manages to juggle the budget around. Okay. And I think we should all applaud him for it.
All right, well, we'll take this on a little further in a moment or two, because but first, Gordon Brown loves above all to be seen as a Chancellor, both for social justice and for business and a stable economy. What isn't clear, though, is whether the Chancellor has made the economy or whether the good economy has made this Chancellor. Evan Davis reports.
In the shadow of Westminster, that definite spring feeling in St James's Park today, and a definite feeling of spring in the economic projections on which the whole government strategy is based. Just 4 months ago, the Chancellor assumed the economy would grow at 2.25% a year for the indefinite future. Now he thinks the economy will grow faster this year and next, before settling back at that normal growth rate. That early bonus growth still means the economy will be 0.75% bigger than he'd thought it would be before. The really good news is the extra growth has no bad inflationary cost. One Treasury official told us there's a bit of a new economy bonus in there. The internet and all that's brought a ray of sun that we'd not forecast. But has the Chancellor done much to create growth in the economy as well as forecasted?
Our anti-poverty goal.
The Chancellor bombarded us with small measures, 59 in all. He described them as the next step to a wealth-owning democracy.
I announced major reforms today to reward enterprise and entrepreneurship, to open up competition in banking, to promote new and growing businesses and e-commerce, and balance growth across all the regions and nations of the United Kingdom.
So how has it all gone down? The old Truman Brewery in London's East End is not actually a brewery. It is in fact a new economy office block. Whatsonwen.com is one of the tenants with 25 employees. The budget has been welcomed here. Of course, it would be.
I think it's an excellent budget for sensible entrepreneurs who are looking to build long-term businesses in Britain and who encourage a culture of employee share ownership. Our business we formed last year, and we've got 25 people up there, all of whom are shareholders in the company. And the reforms to capital gains tax that Gordon Brown has introduced today will mean that those people, when we build our business in the long term, will benefit very substantially. And that's an extremely good thing.
On the other side of town, Fuller's Brewery. It is exactly what it seems, a brewery with no .com after its name. It has far more employees, and the proprietor thinks maybe the emphasis on small startups goes a bit far.
I think too much emphasis probably has been put on the new type of economies. Those economies are not going to survive, those sort of companies are not going to survive unless companies such as Fuller's are also thriving. And we're under a lot of pressure from recent legislation, and some easing of that in some way, some tax breaks which would help us, would have made quite a lot of difference.
And for old economy companies generally, no mention today of old problems, the exchange rate, no mention of Rover. There's little a Chancellor can do on these big company issues, so Gordon Brown sticks to small company ones. Tax experts generally agree the Chancellor has been a bit of a tinkerer.
He certainly believes he is a pro-small business Chancellor. He's brought in a lot of measures which he certainly aims to help small business. The trouble is, what small business really wants is to be left alone to get on and make money, which is what it's trying to do. It really doesn't need a lot of government help, and it certainly doesn't need government red tape. And a lot of the things this government have done have of course, introduced red tape into the system.
But these are just details. Who's complaining today? We citizens are projected to enjoy real disposable income growth of about 4% this year. Without so much as lifting a finger to stoke up a boom, the Chancellor is lazing in the proverbial sun of Britain's best pre-election economy for decades.
Well, now, Peter Kilford, to listen to the Chancellor speak today, you would be completely unaware that there was a catastrophe had hit Birmingham last week in the shape of BMW and Rover, wouldn't you?
Well, I think this is a major challenge for the Chancellor, not just in the West Midlands, but in the regions of England generally. We tend to forget there's not just one economy. There are lots of economies in our country. And of course, when we talk about price inflation or house price inflation, wage inflation in the southeast, the knock-on effects are rather different in other parts of the country where we don't suffer necessarily from those problems. The Chancellor did mention, for example, that what we needed to have were local clusters, centres of high-tech excellence. And this is in a week when we've lost a very high-tech centre of excellence in the northwest, the synchrotron, going down to the Golden Triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London. So there's a disjunction there slightly. He did announce, however, a venture capital fund to encourage business SMEs in particular in the regions. But
small and medium enterprises.
Small and medium enterprises, but the actual figures that were quoted for the Northwest were rather small, 120, 125 million. And it will take a lot more than that in a region like ours, which has been decimated over many, many years in terms of its manufacturing base.
What did you make, Kenneth Clarke, of his enthusiasm for the .com economy?
Oh, well, you're bound to go for fashion. It's a good fashion. There are real things going on.
Give him a sharp sports show.
No, it was okay. It was welcome as far as it goes. The measures he made don't amount to as much as he made them sound, and the success of e-commerce in this country and the .com economy will not depend on today's budget. But that was the easy bit for him. What he did not address, as we're all agreeing, is the catastrophe that's hitting manufacturing, the catastrophe that's hitting agriculture, the damage we're suffering on inward investment into this country because of the strong pound. And whenever you ask Gordon Brown about the strong pound, it's not his responsibility anymore. And whenever you ask Eddie George at the bank, it's not his responsibility either. And the pound is far too high, and there are parts of our economy which are bleeding. And we're forecasting a balance of payments deficit in the Red Book going up from 15 billion to 27 billion. That's more imports, fewer exports. I can remember the days 30 years ago when people used to get really excited about a rapidly deteriorating balance of payments, and all those flowers of spring we've just been seeing on our monitor here, as we saw Evan's last piece. I mean, they're not certain yet. And we have too strong a pound. And to the extent that he tightened fiscal policy, as he kept saying early on he was doing, this was the trouble. He's boxed in now. He couldn't be very generous in this budget because he's frightened of more interest rate increases and the pound getting even stronger or staying where it is.
Well, in that case, he was trying to do something about interest rates in the budget, in as far as he could.
Well, it's all rather late. Just as I was saying in the first half that the money for the NHS is late after for 2 or 3 years he starved it, at least noticing the pound is too strong, it's coming very late for many of our manufacturers.
Chancellor, that you would now take back the power of interest rates?
No,
Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't. But I think fiscal policy and monetary policy go together. An independent bank should talk to a chancellor. The two of them should have sorted out long before now who is responsible for an exchange rate which is 3 Deutschmarks 20, more than that, to use the old-fashioned language I use, compared with the 2 Deutschmarks 50 that it was for most of my time as Chancellor, costs everybody, not just BMW, but everybody a lot of money.
Well, a lot of people would say it shows they've got a lot more confidence in an economy run by Gordon Brown.
No, he doesn't show that at all.
Well, that's how some people put it.
No, it's not good. They don't put the pound up because they say good old Gordon. I don't agree with that. No.
It's the big unmentionable at the heart of this budget. There is actually a serious economic problem with the overvaluation of the pound. It's not just Rover. We lost 120,000 jobs in manufacturing last year in a booming economy. We've seen for 6 quarters manufacturing investment declining. We're losing export market share. We've seen exports go down 10% in manufacturers. We've seen imports go up 9%. We see a doubling of the trade deficit. And he can't talk about it because he will not take a lead on the one thing that might actually provide a solution to this, which is euro entry and making it clear that he's working towards that at a proper exchange rate. But he can't talk about it because the Labour Party dare not take on the press barons who are arguing against euro entry. But it's the only solution, and the manufacturing industry is desperate for it.
Many members of the Labour Party are more than willing to take on the press barons over the euro or anything else.
OK, gentlemen, thank you all very much. Now, it's the Chancellor's privilege to conjure with billions, leaving us to pore over what it means to each of us personally. We've given Peter Snow, the king of computer graphics, the job of counting the pennies in the pockets of those whom Gordon Brown has favoured.
Well, here's the Chancellor driving his bus into Budget Town, brimful of measures to help the lower paid, to help pensioners, to help people with children, but no big tax cuts, and a huge boost for spending. A budget, he said, for a stronger, fairer Britain. And here's the big headline now. A 2.5% real increase in public spending for the next 3 years. And that is quite a period to be going for a 2.5% real increase in spending. Inland revenue, amazingly, no sign of any further tax cuts on top of course, the 1p cut in the basic rate that he announced in the last budget for this coming year. Everything else is directed towards pensioners and the low paid. Minimum income guarantee for pensioners confirmed to rise in line with earnings. Here's the savings disregard up from £3,000 to £6,000. You don't start losing your minimum pension guarantee if your savings are that big. New pensioners' credit to be introduced in the next Parliament for single pensioners with income under £100 and couples under £150. Again, all this directed at pensioners and the low paid. Here we have now, again, another measure for pensioners, the winter fuel allowance. He raised it last year. Up it goes again by £50 to £150. Education, we've talked about health. Education goes up in the coming year by £1 billion extra investment in schools, public spending. £30 per week maintenance allowance for staying on at school is extended. That's at 16 and 18-year-olds who want to stay on at school. That encouragement is extended. And again, a budget directed at children, particularly children of the low paid. The working families tax credit directed at the low paid will be raised. The minimum family income will be raised to £214 a week. The immediate access now takes place to working family tax credit after childbirth, not after you've waited a few months. Income support is raised by £4.35 per child. Again, of course, we're talking here about the low paid all the way through. Maternity grants raised £100 to £300. Families with children. Children's tax credit raised by £26. That's the tax credit he announced would come in next year. It'll now be £26 higher. This will partly make up for the loss of the married couple's allowance, but not, of course, for the better paid, only for the lower paid. It's a very Labour budget, this, directed at helping the lower paid and indeed boosting public spending on the public services. And finally, charity. The Council has some measures to announce on charities. Basically, they are going to encourage people to contribute to charities tax-free. Charities will not now be charged tax of any kind, nor will the giver, on charity donations, particularly and including corporate donations. So there we are, a budget hugely geared towards helping the low paid, towards helping those with children, and towards public spending increases. No sign of any tax cuts. That could be next year, and that could be the year when the election is.
Now, in a moment, we'll be looking at how the papers view today's budget, but before that, a look at today's other news.
Good evening. It's a shorter Newsnight Scotland tonight because of the budget. And for those of you who've just joined us, a quick reminder of the main points. Gordon Brown announced the overall tax burden would remain much the same, with more money going on services. There'll be an extra £2 billion next month for the NHS, an extra £1 billion for education, and £280 million more on roads and public transport. There was no cut in income tax apart from the 1p reduction announced last year, which comes into effect next month. The Indian government has blamed Kashmiri separatist groups supported by Pakistan for the massacre of 36 Sikhs in the disputed Northern Territory. But the separatists claim the Indians were behind the attack in an attempt to undermine the start of President Clinton's visit to India. Mr. Clinton said the killings highlighted the suffering caused by the conflict over Kashmir.
The funeral pyres burn in Chittasingpura after one of the worst sectarian attacks in Kashmir. Emotions run high. The Indian authorities have predicted an upsurge of violence during President Clinton's visit, aimed at drawing attention to the Kashmir dispute and drawing the Americans in. No one had expected an attack on a Sikh village, a community that had never been targeted here before. The gunmen separated the men from the women and children and then opened fire. This is now a bewildered and angry community. In Delhi, President Clinton was paying homage with daughter Chelsea at the memorial to Mahatma Gandhi, the founding father of modern India, the champion of non-violent political change who died at the hands of an assassin. A convention on the itinerary of visiting dignitaries with a particular poignancy today. Tonight, the world's biggest democracy threw a banquet for the world's most powerful leader. It set the seal on what's intended to be a new partnership between the two countries, supposedly strong enough to withstand the differences between them.
The public should have been consulted over plans to site a secure psychiatric unit at Stobhill Hospital, according to Greater Glasgow Health Board. At a meeting today, the board admitted they had been wrong and promised lessons would be learned. Their admission follows a report criticising the handling of the proposals. Pope John Paul has arrived in Israel on the second part of his pilgrimage to the Middle East. It's only the second visit to the region by a head of the Catholic Church. Earlier, thousands of people gathered in Jordan where the Pope celebrated Mass.
He is old and frail now, but believers adore him still. In Amman, the crowd could not get close enough to Pope John Paul. In this troubled region, he is calling for peace between countries and between faiths, and many here hunger for that.
I'm a Muslim, and his message reached me as well. I understood the importance of peace, and I am supporting him in coming to this Mass.
There was lots of symbolism today about new beginnings. These young children made their first communion. But without real peace in the Middle East, their future is uncertain, and no one can say when that will come. Tonight, finally, he arrived in Jerusalem and was welcomed as a friend of Israel. Unthinkable not so awfully long ago. But he has also come as a friend of the Palestinians. He will have to tread carefully here.
The bill to outlaw fox hunting in Scotland began its parliamentary passage today. The Rural Affairs Committee laid out a timetable for evidence. The sponsor of the bill, Mike Watson, hopes fox hunting will be illegal by late autumn. But the bill's opponents are likely to table a series of amendments which could delay it well into next year. A 13-year-old has been reported to the Procurator Fiscal following an incident in which a boy fell 20 feet from the emergency exit of a school bus. The 12-year-old boy from St Andrews High School in Kirkcaldy is in a critical condition at Edinburgh's Children's Hospital after suffering serious head injuries. A team of international fingerprint analysts has backed the case of a former Strathclyde police officer who stood trial for perjury. Shirley Mackie denied a fingerprint found at a crime scene was hers. The courts agreed and she was eventually cleared. The case is now the subject of an independent inquiry into the use of fingerprint evidence in Scotland.
Shirley Mackie was in Edinburgh today, supported by fingerprint experts from home and abroad.
Fingerprint identification stripped to its simplest elements.
Those who are backing the former police officer and her campaign are seeking answers from the Justice Minister about the treatment she received. Shirley Mackie was a detective in Strathclyde Police when in 1997 she was charged with perjury for denying that a fingerprint at the scene of a crime was hers. She was eventually cleared, but is still seeking to establish why she's been put through this ordeal. Fingerprint experts from America and the United Kingdom say the case has raised serious questions about procedures used in Scotland's fingerprint laboratories.
Even under your Scottish procedures, where it's an empirical science, it's still not identical. There are a lot of inconsistencies.
The Justice Minister, Jim Wallace, has consistently been pressed to address the case of Shirley Mackie and fingerprinting in Scotland. That review has now started.
Union leaders are travelling to Germany for further talks with BMW to warn the company of a mounting opposition campaign to its breakup of Rover. Large demonstrations at Longbridge in Birmingham have been planned next month. Rover has confirmed that production has been cut at its Longbridge and Cowley plants after BMW's decision to sell. Prince Philip has been courting controversy in Australia. He toured a cheese factory without wearing a white coat or hairnet. Buckingham Palace has dismissed claims the cheese will have to be destroyed because the Prince breached hygiene regulations. It was the fourth day of the Queen's Australian tour and she spent the day visiting a children's hospital in Sydney. And that's all from Newsnight Scotland tonight. Anne will be back with a full programme tomorrow. And meanwhile, it's back to Jeremy in London.
The smart money's now on an election sometime in the spring of next year, so this was effectively the last budget to make an impact on people's lives. The top priority is obviously the health service, which will make life extremely difficult for most other government departments who spend money. The question is whether today's announcements prove persuasive.
I think it's a good budget in an extraordinarily good economic situation for a Labour Chancellor. The public finances sound brilliant. He's just piling up all this money which he's either giving to hospitals or paying off the debt. Amazing. I mean, I've seen Labour Chancellors in the past lash to the mast in the middle of a typhoon. Dennis Healey, it went on for years. With Brown, it's all calm seas and sunshine.
Well, we think it was a good budget broadly for some readers, definitely. There were many good points in it. Health and education spending was very good news indeed. But we do have a gripe, and on our front page tomorrow morning, we are warning that it's now going to cost £50 to fill up a Ford Mondeo. And of course, it was Mondeo man that the Prime Minister famously set out to woo at the last election. That's a problem. We've got a problem with that.
I think it's a bad budget because there's nothing in it for enterprise. It's a budget of a Chancellor who thinks that he can spend our money better than we can. We think it looks like an old-fashioned Labour tax and spend budget with a few knobs on to try and disguise it.
It's a supremely competent budget from an exceptionally able Chancellor. I suspect that if there is one fly in the ointment, it is that given that Labour's opposition in Scotland comes from the left in the form of the SNP, the Chancellor would have done well to be even more generous than he has decided to be on this occasion in terms of the increases in public spending. Scotland would have liked a little more than the Chancellor has felt it prudent and wise to give.
And Mark and Evan are back with us, as is Richard Lambert, the editor of the FT. How has he managed to do this?
Well, he's got a terrific hand to start off with. I mean, thanks to good luck and a bit of judgment, he starts off with a wonderful hand to play. I mean, no Chancellor has been able to have this kind of background to a budget since I can remember, so he's very lucky.
And terribly hard, I'd imagine, for the Conservatives to mount much of an attack on him.
Well, I thought what he was doing today was quite... One of the political things he was doing today, which I thought was interesting, was he was changing the debate for the next election, whenever that is, next 15 months, away from, are taxes going to go up? And what he wants you to be asking people, what he wants you to be asking Mr Hague is, what of my pet spending increases are you going to cut? Because the big ones, the big spending increases are coming after the next election. And he wants, you know, normally at election times, we all discuss, we say that the Tories are going to cut taxes and the Labour Party may or may not increase them. He wants you to talk about spending and which spending cuts.
Sure, it's a gamble, though, about human nature, isn't it? Because in the end, the electorate very often say one thing and then decide another on the basis of their personal advantage.
Yeah, but as long as they're feeling prosperous, which if the economy continues on its present track, they will be feeling this time next year, that's not a bad gamble to take. The risks he's taking, the economic risks, there are some risks, but they won't already kick in for 2 or 3 years' time.
And as far as your core readership is concerned, people who run...
I met one of those ones.
Really? As far as the people who run big financial institutions and so on, and companies, what do they make of?
Well, there are two reactions. One is the sort of city reaction, and they are bored stiff, but they are always wrong. They always get budgets wrong on night one. So
they speak pretty highly of your paper, too.
Business, actually, interesting. Our reporting on business is, it looks as